Apocalypse will tell anyone who listens to him that he's simply a mirror held up to nature. Survival of the fittest, he says, is not his invention, it's the oldest law in existence, and he's his most honest disciple. But then that claim falls apart the moment you realize and look closely at who Apocalypse actually is and what he actually does. He doesn't test the world and step back to see who survives. He builds machines, cults, and armies that make sure that the outcome matches what he already decided in advance. That's not natural selection, that's control dressed up as philosophy. Today we're going to dig into the psychology underneath En Sabah Nur, the first mutant, and figure out why a 5,000-year-old god complex still tells itself it's just following nature's orders. Apocalypse's entire ideology of survival of the fittest functions as a psychological defense against a much larger, much older, much more human fear, the fear of death and irrelevance. Underneath the god complex is a creature who was abandoned as an infant, nearly killed as a child, and who spent 1,000 years building an identity so large that death itself would ask him for permission. We're going to look at this through terror management theory, through social dominance orientation, and through the psychology of narcissism. And by the end, I think you'll see that Apocalypse is less a cartoonish supervillain and more as a portrayal of what happens when trauma gets infinity time and infinity power to calcify into Apocalypse's origin has been told a few different ways since his first appearance in X Factor number 6 in 1986, but the version that matters the most for this conversation comes from Rise of Apocalypse in 1994 and later expansions on his backstory. En Sabah Nur was born in ancient Egypt with visible mutations, abandoned in a desert by a mother who couldn't bear to look at his face and left to die. He survived barely and found a nomadic tribe led by a slaver named Baal, who would teach him how to grow up in extreme conditions of scarcity and violence where the weak really did die and the strong really did take everything. That environment isn't incidental to who he becomes, it in fact becomes his blueprint. A child who learns before he can even speak that weakness gets you left in the sand doesn't walk away from that lesson. He builds an entire cosmology around it so that the lesson never has to happen to him again. By the time we reach the modern era of the character, En Sabah Nur has transformed himself quite literally, using ancient celestial technology to extend his life across the millennia. He's not simply old, he's engineered his own immortality, cycling through host bodies, manipulating history from the shadows, and positioning himself as the architect behind mutant evolution itself. But this is where the psychology gets interesting, because a being who has already solved death for himself keeps talking about death obsessively for everyone else. Terror management theory argues that a huge amount of human behavior is an unconscious response to the awareness of their own mortality. Because humans are the one species that knows it's going to die, we build cultural worldviews, belief systems, legacies, and symbolic immortality projects to buffer ourselves against that terror. Religion, nationalism, art, even parenting, these can all function as ways of saying I will leave something behind that outlasts my body. Apocalypse is terror management taken to its most literal extreme. He doesn't just build a symbolic legacy, he builds an actual physical immortality project, jumping bodies, manipulating genetics, finding secret societies across centuries that all exist to serve one goal, making sure En Sabah Nur never truly ends. His entire philosophy of survival of the fittest isn't really about nature, it's a worldview constructed so airtight that death becomes something that only happens to the weak. And Apocalypse has spent 5,000 years making absolutely sure he will never be counted among them. This is why he frames every conflict in evolutionary language. If the world operates on survival of the fittest and Apocalypse has survived longer than any mutant in record history, then by his own logic, he has already won the argument that truly matters. The ideology isn't deceptive, it's somewhat protective. It exists to answer a question he can never let himself ask directly, which is what happens to En Sabah Nur if the strong stops being strong. Could it be social dominance orientation? Social dominance orientation describes a general preference for hierarchy, where some groups are seen as inherently superior and entitled to dominate others. People high in this orientation tend to endorse ideologies that legitimize inequality, framing it not as something imposed by power, but as something nature intended through natural, earned, or biological destiny. Apocalypse's worldview is a textbook legitimization myth. He doesn't say, I want power because I enjoy control. He says that the strong are simply supposed to rule and the weak are simply supposed to serve or perish. And he's only accelerating a process that was already going to happen. That framing does two things psychologically. It removes personal responsibility because he's not choosing cruelty, he's just following nature, and it removes any possibility of guilt because you can't feel guilty about reinforcing a law that you didn't write. What makes this especially compelling as a character study is that Apocalypse applies this hierarchy even within the mutant community he claims to champion. He's not actually interested in mutant liberation the way that Magneto is. He's interested in mutant selection, calling anyone mutant or human who doesn't meet his standard of fitness. His Four Horsemen storyline across decades of Uncanny X-Men and X-Force show this clearly. He doesn't recruit allies, but he rather conscripts servants, transforming their bodies against their will in many tellings and discards them the moment that they show weakness. A belief in natural hierarchy that conveniently always places the believer at the top isn't really about natural selection, it's a belief in the self wearing nature's clothing. The third piece is what psychologists sometimes describe as malignant narcissism, a pattern that combines grandiosity, a lack of empathy, paranoia, and a willingness to justify cruelty in service of a grand self-image. Apocalypse doesn't see himself as a villain. He sees himself as a shepherd, even a savior, guiding evolution towards its rightful conclusion. This is a messiah complex in its purest form, the conviction that you will and the will of a larger cosmic or natural order are the same thing. This matters because it explains why Apocalypse is so difficult to negotiate with compared to other X-Men villains. Magneto can be reasoned with because his cruelty comes from trauma and fear that can at some times be addressed. Apocalypse's cruelty comes from conviction. He's not afraid of mutants losing the war against humanity because he believes that he already knows how the story ends. This is why he appointed himself both the author and the proof of the theory. When a person, or in this case a 5,000-year-old mutant, fuses their identity with that ideology, challenging that ideology stops feeling like a debate and starts feeling like an attack on the self. That's why Apocalypse responds to opposition not with argument but with immediate, often disproportionate violence. Disagreement isn't a difference of opinion to him. It is a threat to a belief system that his entire sense of self depends on being true. It's worth putting this next to Charles Xavier for a second because the contrast sharpens exactly what Apocalypse represents. Xavier's philosophy also grapples with mutant evolution and mutant identity, but Xavier's core belief is that strength is not the only thing worth protecting and that a society is measured by how it treats the most vulnerable members and not its most powerful ones. Apocalypse looks at that philosophy and sees weakness rewarding weakness, a system that in his mind guarantees stagnation and decay. But here's the irony worth sitting with. Xavier, a man who has faced his own mortality repeatedly, who has been paralyzed, who has died and returned many times throughout the franchise's long history, he responds by building a community. Apocalypse, facing the exact same universal fear that every conscious individual faces, responds by trying to become a god. The difference between these two responses tells you everything you need to know about which one is actually psychologically healthy and which one is a 5,000-year-old trauma response wearing a language of bigotry. So when Apocalypse tells you he's simply nature's most honest servant, I would push back on that completely. He's not honest about nature, he's honest about fear, not just in the way he thinks. Every part of his ideology, the immortality, the hierarchy, the calling of the weak, the total intolerance for dissent, traces back to that child who was left in the desert that day, who decided from that moment on that he was no longer going to be the most vulnerable thing in the room. Permanently and undeniably, he wanted to be the strongest thing in the room. Survival of the fittest was never his philosophy of nature, it was his armor against being a victim again. And that, more than any celestial technology and any horseman he has ever created, is the most human thing about him. If you find this video interesting, please do all the YouTube things, like, share, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think about Apocalypse and the psychological aspect of Apocalypse, if there was anything I missed. Until the next one, which will be Rogue, I believe, I will see you then. I'm Anderson, and I'm out. Bye.